It is my honor, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce to you our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Darren Beattie. Dr. Darren Beattie is a former White House speechwriter and policy development aide to President Trump. While a visiting professor at Duke, he distinguished himself as the only non-tenured academic in the country to have publicly endorsed our candidate Trump. He is now a political consultant and writer. Please help me introduce Dr. Darren Beattie.
Testing, thank you. Please be quiet during this speech. I'll assume anyone talking voted for Hillary Clinton. As mentioned in the introduction, I have the distinction of being the only non-tenured full-time academic in the country to have publicly endorsed then candidate Trump. A distinction that I'm actually more proud of is I was the only faculty member at Duke to have correctly predicted the outcome of the election, which actually irritated my colleagues much more. Of course, I can pat myself on the back as an academic, but what I knew was simply what tens of millions of patriotic Americans knew in their bones, which was that Donald Trump was going to win. Nonetheless, it was a great pleasure to experience an overlap between my own personal political convictions and my academic position that the political categories as existed after the Cold War were obsolete. And I interpreted Trump as a necessary and desirable first step toward this political realignment. This helps us to contextualize this Never Trump phenomenon that occurred during the campaign. Indeed, the Never Trump people would say Donald Trump is not a real conservative. And traditional conservatives would say, indeed, he is. He actually is the real conservative. I would say, in fact, a lot of what attracts me to Donald Trump is what distinguishes him from traditional conservatism. In other words, what attracted to me and what is ultimately significant about Trump was what distinguished him from the other Republicans in the primary field and not necessarily what distinguished him from Hillary. In any case, it raises an interesting question as to what is conservatism and why indeed do we package together a certain position on tax reform, a certain position on foreign policy, a certain position on trade, abortion, and so forth. How are these things packaged together to form a coherent ideology? Some would say they essentially belong together. Others would say they're simply arbitrary. I would say they are contingently related to the circumstances of the Cold War. And after the Cold War, this old conservative ideology did more to obfuscate than it did to actually clarify our situation. Example, free market is great as an opposition to a Soviet command economy. However, a free market as a broad term that encapsulates Goldman Sachs, Walmart, and the neighborhood lemonade stand is an overly broad term that does not respect necessarily and deeply important distinctions. In other words, the free market of Goldman Sachs is not the free market of the lemonade stand. And a conservative vocabulary does not appreciate that distinction, is obsolete, and deserves to die. Another feature that was not factored into the old conservative vocabulary is an uncanny symbiosis that developed between a certain virulent strain of leftist identity politics and post-war capitalist structures. Indeed, on the side of the left, they would not want to even acknowledge this because the left is animated by a psychological need to think of themselves as critiquing powerful structures, not being instruments of them. On the other side, the right would not want to acknowledge this strange symbiosis because many, unfortunately, on the right are still beholden to donors with corporate interests represented precisely by those capitalist structures. This led to a situation in which a pure populist election was possible, in which every single powerful institution in the West the corporate media, the military-industrial complex, the establishment of the Republican Party, of the Democrat Party, even the Pope were aligned against candidate Trump, and candidate Trump nevertheless won because he had the one institution that mattered, namely the support of the people. Beyond the substantive significance and desirability of that victory, it's actually very interesting for another reason. Namely, one consider it a laboratory-made test case, or in other words, a stress test for democracy itself. Put another way, if a candidate with simply the support of the people can win against the coordinated opposition of every single powerful institution in the society, that says something healthy about the functioning of our democratic institutions. And this stress test was passed. And it's precisely for this reason that the enemies of Trump have focused specifically and virulently on the democratic legitimacy of Trump's victory. Mueller report is only one example. Now, surprise, surprise, it wasn't a happy ending simply after the election. All of these oppositional forces did not die after the election, and as Steve Bannon said, if you think the administrative state is going out without a fight, you're kidding yourself. And they've been fighting harder than ever, unfortunately. This has led to disappointing results that we must face. Progression on the border wall has been underwhelming, and the borders are as porous as ever. This is not only disgraceful, this is ludicrous in the precise and literal sense that it is laughable and indicates that we are becoming no longer a serious country. And as much as I'm inspired by an event such as this, which shows that the civic heart of American patriotism is still beating, and that private citizens with private money can come together and do amazing things. This is true and important. However, we should not emphasize this tremendous victory of private enterprise as an excuse for the failure of our own government institutions. After all, this failure is not necessary. Our government at one time helped us dig the Panama Canal, build the Hoover Dam, and as we've learned recently, put a man on the moon. It is inspiring how much money we have raised in this noble effort. But in another sense, it underscores the depressing fact that actually there was a different fundraiser for the wall. And much money was raised. That was called Tax Day, April 15th, where we brought in trillions of dollars of revenue. And somehow we can't spare 20 billion of that, a minuscule fraction. Incidentally, ask yourself how many people in charge of this country know how many zeros there are in a trillion? Zero. We can't find 20 billion to fund the wall. After $7 trillion spent on Mideast wars since 2001, that is, for perspective, more than the collective market capitalization of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google combined, plus the entirety of student loan debt, plus private credit card debt. After all of that, not $20 billion for a wall to protect our country. After $800 billion in military budget funding, not $20 billion to build a wall. I'm almost thinking a better prospect for us, maybe we can give Raytheon or Boeing the contract for the wall, and we'll have a better chance of it getting built. And so you see my point. It's not just lack of substantial progress on the wall or immigration at a time where immigration is registered in polls as a matter of highest importance amongst the electorate. It is something deeper than that, because this stress test of democracy that was passed when Trump won, which leads to a certain justified sense of optimism, if we don't implement the agenda that was run on, that leads to the prospect of a profound cynicism with respect to democracy and our democratic institutions. And I want to conclude briefly by talking about other features of this institutional failures. Another aspect of institutional failure that has not changed and is indeed exacerbated is a lack of accountability. This is evident in the fact that not a single person has been made accountable for our disastrous Mideast wars. And in fact, some people, unfortunately, even in the administration, have been awarded personnel-wise. There's been not a single person held responsible for the financial crisis of 2008. There's not a single person held to account for the opioid crisis, which continues to ravage our nation. And there is not a single person who has actually been held accountable for this now revealed Russia hoax, in which the upper echelons of the CIA, of the FBI, of the DOJ conspired in a semi-coup attempt to attack the legitimacy of the president. I'm not holding my breath for accountability. I think we'll see the hearings, it'll wash away just like everything else, and it's back to our regularly scheduled programming of socialism versus hamburgers. Another aspect of democratic accountability has to do with free speech in the public square. Isn't it interesting that all these people who talk about so-called free movement of goods as free trade, of people who talk about free movement of labor as open borders, are conspicuously silent about the free movement of information on the internet? In fact, they've been vigorously opposed to it and suppressing it. Major tech organizations such as Google have reacted in literal tears to the victory of Donald Trump and have vowed to never let it happen again. And we've heard countless stories in this very symposium about how immigration patriots have been silenced and deplatformed. People with millions and millions of followers. Make no mistake, your commissars in big tech are doing everything they can to make sure the American people will never meddle in their own elections again. I could go on, but I conclude this portion by simply saying an obvious and lamentable fact that every single institution in the United States is either actively malicious against the American people or a scam. In a healthy system, in fact, these institutions would be very important. In a healthy system, there would be a functional deep state, which in an important way would offer continuity and stability to complement the vicissitudes of democratic populism. In fact, democratic populism is not necessarily so much a corrective to this institutional collapse of the deep state. In some ways, extreme populism is actually a symptom of this institutional failure. And this brings me to my last point, which registers a concept in the title of this talk, which is the tyranny of myopia, and is the last and perhaps most severe consequence of our institutional failures. And that is, due to our lack of a functioning institutional system, we are no longer able to undertake great long-term projects or to address seriously deep structural problems in our system in the long term. In his opening remarks, Chris Kobach said something quite profound. He pointed to the fact that this physical structure of the wall will last longer than every single living sentient being listening to my words right now in the audience. Somehow, this physical wall is therefore a tangible expression of our will to survive as a nation. But it also sets us to think of the connection between sovereignty itself and long-term thinking. If I'm an individual and I want to plan long-term, say I'm 23 years old, and I want to plan for certain goals when I'm 40 or 50, it sounds bizarre and commonsensical, but I have to be aware that I'm indeed the same person that I will be in an essential sense when I'm 40 as I am when I'm 23. There has to be a structural integrity and coherence to who I am as an individual now and who I will be as an individual in 20, 30 years for me to undertake long-term plans and projects as an individual. This is the same thing for us as a country. If we don't have structural integrity, if we don't have social cohesion, if we are not a unified whole as a country, we will be incapable of executing long-term plans into the future. And this is the most devastating consequence of our widespread institutional collapse. Now, I might sound a bit pessimistic in this speech, but I represent the best kind of pessimism, what a great philosopher once called a pessimism of strength. Because indeed, I am utterly confident that talented, energetic Americans have what it takes to navigate the troubled waters ahead in the next few decades. In keeping with my own prescription, I like to invoke a heuristic, and that is as follows. Imagine it is the year 2044. Imagine that America in 2044 is still a real country in a meaningful sense, and it is not a dystopian nightmare. Backwards engineer a plausible scenario leading up to that point. I'm optimistic because I do have such a scenario, which falls beyond the scope of this talk. But I will conclude with this, that whatever scenario you tell yourself leading up to that point in 2044, it must involve us being willing to boldly acknowledge the deep structural bottlenecks to progress and the institutional failure I've described. And it also requires an awareness that winning the argument is always great. Winning elections is always great. But we must always be mindful that as great and as necessary as it is to win the argument and to win the election, it is not to be considered a consolation prize for losing the country. Thank you.